The fog had rolled in early that morning, drifting like a thin grey veil through the narrow streets of Oxford, and I found myself walking along St. Edmund's Lane with no particular urgency, only the quiet need to think. The lamps cast halos that trembled against the wet cobbles, and the occasional crunch of footsteps echoed with a hollow, deliberate pace. Somewhere distant, a bell tolled, though the hour was uncertain, its resonance lingering like an unanswered question. I had been restless for days, the sort of restlessness that comes from noticing too much and speaking too little, and so I walked, noting the subtle way the mist caught in the wrought iron gates of St. Edmund's College. There was a Beadle stationed near the entrance, small, precise, and almost invisible if one did not pay attention. Yet something about him struck me, the slight stiffness in his posture, the way his eyes seemed to measure not just the comings and goings of students, but the shadows themselves. I observed him idly, letting my thoughts drift to Professor Ainsworth, whose name had surfaced in a clipped paragraph from the Oxford Gazette, though the details had seemed innocuous. A chill ran along the nape of my neck, not from the cold, but from the recognition that appearances seldom told the full story. The Beadle shifted, just enough to reveal a hand tucked beneath his coat, as though guarding something unseen, and my curiosity deepened without any conscious plan to act upon it. I turned toward the cobbled alley that skirted the college wall, and in that half-light, the world seemed pared down to essential elements: stone, fog, and the precise rhythm of human passage. I noticed a smudge of ink on a discarded leaflet, a fragment of verse misquoted, the sort of detail most would dismiss but which had a way of lingering. Such minutiae were often the unnoticed hinges upon which later revelations swung, though I did not yet know what door they might unlock. The smell of paper, damp with the rain from the night before, mingled with the faint aroma of peat smoke drifting from a nearby chimney, and I allowed the sensory detail to anchor me while my mind traced possible narratives in idle loops. A student passed, briefcase clutched to his chest, head down against the mist. His step faltered slightly, just for a fraction of a heartbeat that might have been coincidence. And yet it reminded me of the subtlety required in observation, how a hesitation, a glance, a pause in the rhythm of daily life could carry meaning if one were patient enough to wait for it. I noted it without intrusion, letting it exist as a quiet signal. The Beadle watched, still, unblinking, and the alley seemed to stretch longer than memory or geography would allow. I felt the pulse of Oxford in that stretch of lane, simultaneously eternal and fleeting, and I understood why some truths hid so easily amidst the stones and fog. I did not approach, nor did I speak, content to measure the moment, catalogue the details, and allow intuition to stir beneath the surface. Even in the absence of action, a story was beginning, though it was delicate, as if the fog itself whispered the first syllables of a sentence not yet written. The news of Professor Ainsworth's passing reached me by a muted whisper rather than the clamor of any official announcement. I had been in my room at St. John's, examining a fragment of a misprinted journal, when Lewis entered with that hesitant expression that always precedes the conferral of unwelcome intelligence. He spoke in tones almost too low to carry, as though raising the volume would make the world less certain. I listened, the words hovering over the quiet crackle of the fire, and immediately sensed the subtle discrepancies in the narrative. The death reported as sudden, a collapse in his chambers, yet the phrasing in the Gazette hinted at something slightly off, an odd choice of verb, a comma that should not have been there, a line break that unsettled the rhythm. I walked slowly along the gallery, noticing the floorboards creak unevenly beneath my boots, reflecting on the fact that in Oxford the dead rarely left as quietly as the living might wish. The tutors I spoke with were careful, mannered in their grief, yet the glances exchanged across polished mahogany hinted at unspoken tensions. One mentioned, almost incidentally, that Ainsworth had been troubled by a minor disagreement over a fellowship, his voice faltering only slightly before it regained composure. Such micro-expressions, subtle as the twitch of an eyelid, often illuminate more than long monologues of confession. I catalogued them silently, storing them alongside other fragments, the faint scent of ink and tobacco in his study, the misaligned paperweight atop his desk, and a folded letter that had apparently gone unnoticed in the initial sweep of his room. At lunchtime, I observed the junior tutor moving with a peculiar precision, placing books back in alphabetical order with an almost mechanical care, pausing briefly over one title as though uncertain of its rightful place. The gesture was fleeting, yet it lodged itself in my mind, a potential key among many doors. In another life, I might have dismissed it entirely, but there was a cadence to the hesitation, a rhythm that suggested something intentionally left unspoken. I wondered whether it was fear, guilt, or simple habit, and, as often happens, I knew the distinction would reveal itself in due course, not immediately. By mid-afternoon, I'd visited the lecture hall where Ainsworth had last delivered a talk, noting the empty chairs and the faint, lingering aroma of chalk and old wood. A student lingered in the corner, pretending to read notes, but I caught the glance aimed at the doorway. It was almost imperceptible, yet to me it spoke volumes, the weight of a secret held for reasons beyond youth or malice. Later, back in the library, I discovered a tiny inconsistency in the printed catalogue, a misdated entry for one of Ainsworth's lectures off by a week. Perhaps an innocent typographical slip, or perhaps a small artifact of deeper manipulation. It was the kind of detail that glimmers faintly, requiring patience and observation before it illuminates the broader pattern. The evening drew down with rain brushing the windows, soft as sighs, and I found myself seated at my desk, reflecting on the juxtaposition of grief and calculation. Nothing was yet conclusive, and yet each fragment, each whispered glance or hesitant word, was a breadcrumb on a path I could not yet fully trace. Oxford itself seemed to lean closer, stone and fog conspiring to hide and reveal in equal measure, leaving me alone with the thought that sometimes the quietest deaths speak the loudest. The following morning, I found myself standing before the worn oak doors of St. Edmund's College, the fog lingering low and damp over the cloisters. Inside, the quiet was punctuated only by the soft scratch of pen on parchment and the occasional cough of a librarian whose patience had long since adapted to the idiosyncrasies of Oxford scholars. I requested access to the college register, a document more of habit than utility for most, but for me it was a ledger of subtle truths where hours, names, and small annotations often whispered more than conversation could. The pages were yellowed and brittle at the edges, but the entries were precise, every visitor noted with meticulous attention. I traced a finger down the column until a familiar name appeared, the Beadle. He had signed in several times at unusual hours, the ink slightly darker on one occasion, as though the pen had been freshly loaded or the scribe's hand held with unusual pressure. Such minor inconsistencies, meaningless to most, set my mind in motion, like the first faint tremor before a larger revelation. I paused over the dates that coincided with Professor Ainsworth's final days, noting the precise overlap. It was a small, almost imperceptible pattern, yet to me it suggested intention rather than coincidence. I recalled the gestures of those I'd observed the day before, the junior tutor's hesitant pause, the student's fleeting glance, the Beadle's silent vigilance. Each seemed like a thread that might unravel a larger tapestry if one were patient enough to trace it through ink and paper. Among the other entries, a misdated lecture caught my attention, off by precisely 1 week. Most would dismiss it as a clerical error, but I had long learned that errors in order, however trivial, often conceal deliberate interference, especially when paired with the mechanical precision of habitual observers. Turning the pages slowly, I noticed a small annotation in the margin, a cross beside a name without explanation. It was the sort of detail that could be ignored or lost entirely, yet it resonated with the faint rhythm of a crossword clue left incomplete, an invitation to think laterally. My mind catalogued it silently, filing the anomaly alongside other fragments, the scent of old paper, the faint smudge of ink near the heading, and the subtle indentation of a hand pressed too firmly against the page. Nothing confirmed anything yet, but the small irregularities murmured possibilities. I stepped back, allowing the silence of the room to settle over me like a soft blanket. Outside, the rain tapped the leaded windows, each drop a muted percussion against the stone. The Beadle had been present at the register again the previous evening, according to the scribbled notes, a time when no ordinary visitor should have entered. I lingered on the image of his slight figure in the misted courtyard, and a quiet deduction began to form. There was a deliberate attention to timing, a rhythm in which presence and absence were manipulated, though for what purpose remained unclear. Closing the register gently, I sensed the weight of possibility pressing in. The ledger held the silent echoes of comings and goings, and among its orderly lines, a narrative began to emerge, fragile and tentative, like the first light of dawn breaking through Oxford's fog. I left the room with the quiet knowledge that every detail mattered, every seemingly minor entry, a whisper pointing toward the edges of truth, yet to be fully discerned. In this city of stone and memory, even the act of recording attendance could conceal secrets, and I resolved to follow the paper trail wherever it might lead. I returned to Professor Ainsworth's study in the late afternoon, the fog having thickened outside to a point where the lanterns along St. Edmund's Lane seemed to hover in isolation, their light muted and tremulous. The room smelled faintly of must and parchment, an aroma that settles around a life long devoted to scholarship, and I let my fingers trace the spines of his collected works while the soft tick of the mantel clock marked time with patient insistence. It was there, among a loose bundle of notes and letters, that I noticed the slip of a fragment of verse, familiar yet not quite right, misquoted from Tennyson, the cadence slightly off, a word omitted or misplaced. Most would not have paused over such a trivial error, but I knew that literary missteps often carried hidden meaning, intentional or otherwise. The misquotation occupied a small corner of a letter addressed to an academic peer, folded with care but evidently read many times. I held it against the light, noting the faint indentation of a seal long since broken, and considered the possible implications. Ainsworth had been meticulous, a man whose pride in precision extended beyond scholarship into the realm of personal correspondence. For him to misquote Tennyson suggested distraction, irritation, or perhaps an effort to conceal a reference only understood by the recipient. It was the kind of nuance that might unravel a carefully constructed narrative, though in that moment it hovered like a note in a minor key, hinting at discord without announcing it fully. I recalled the minor gestures from earlier conversations, the junior tutor's slight hesitation when speaking of Ainsworth's lecture series, the student who lingered too long at the doorway, and the Beadle's unblinking attention near the gates. Each seemed ordinary when observed in isolation, yet juxtaposed with the misquoted verse, they formed a faint lattice of suggestion. There was a rhythm here, a quiet insistence that something had been altered or overlooked, and I catalogued it without haste, allowing intuition to stir beneath the surface rather than forcing a premature conclusion. I examined the letter again, noting the way the ink had pooled slightly at the end of certain lines, evidence that the writer's hand had lingered, perhaps over words carefully chosen or deliberately vague. The misquoted poet was a marker, an anchor that drew my attention to other small details in the room. A misfiled manuscript, a faint smear on the desk blotter, the subtle alignment of papers that suggested human intervention rather than randomness. It was all a network of minor irregularities, yet each contained the potential to illuminate motive or method when the broader pattern emerged. Outside, rain began to tap the window in irregular bursts, soft but persistent. punctuating my thoughts with natural rhythm. The light dimmed and shadows pooled across the carpet, and in that half-light I realized the misquotation was not merely an error, but a signal. Faint, yet insistent, pointing toward the subtleties I had begun to suspect in the interplay of presence and absence, speech and silence, memory and omission. The quiet insistence of the details whispered that what seemed simple might be profoundly misleading. I placed the letter back among the others, the misquotation lingering in my mind as a small, unclaimed clue. Even in the absence of confrontation or violence, a story was forming in the margins of Ainsworth's life, fragile yet insistent. It was a reminder that in Oxford, as elsewhere, the smallest deviations from expectation could illuminate far more than the grand gestures, and that the human mind, when patient and observant, could discern meaning in the most subtle of places. I met Lewis in a small, quiet cafe, tucked away from the regular bustle of High Street, a place where the smell of brewing tea mingled with the faint, persistent aroma of old books pressed into the wood-paneled walls. The rain tapped against the windows in irregular rhythms, a soft percussion that mirrored the cautious deliberation of our conversation. We spoke in hushed tones, discussing the peculiarities surrounding Professor Ainsworth's death. Though neither of us made any attempt at finality, the facts remained fragmented, like the delicate pieces of a puzzle one is not yet ready to assemble. Lewis observed that the Beadle had been present at odd hours, and I noted how the comment lingered, unfinished, almost reluctant to pin down. There was a subtle hesitation in his phrasing, the sort of pause that betrays a mind cataloguing detail rather than merely recounting events. I sipped my tea, the warmth grounding me while my attention traced the minor gestures of the cafe around us, the careful arrangement of cups, the slight tremor in a server's hand as she refilled a sugar bowl, the manner in which a patron adjusted his spectacles repeatedly as if rereading the same line with growing awareness. Each small observation, seemingly incidental, fed into the larger narrative I was beginning to discern. A local librarian passed by, leaving a folded slip of paper on the table anonymously dropped, yet somehow meant to reach someone. I unfolded it carefully, noting a reference to a cancelled lecture and a missing diary page, cryptic in phrasing but precise enough to suggest insider knowledge. The annotations, almost imperceptible to the casual eye, provided subtle confirmation of a pattern I had suspected, that within the serene order of Oxford's collegiate life, human pride and secret grievances wove a tapestry far more intricate than the daily routines would suggest. As we continued, Lewis mentioned the junior tutor's insistence on alphabetizing manuscripts, a gesture I had seen before, yet only now did it take on additional weight. I realized it was not mere fastidiousness, but a methodical act of concealment, a way to obscure a timeline or to mask the movement of certain documents. It was in these seemingly innocuous actions that the truth often resides, quiet and patient, waiting for the observant mind to illuminate it. My fingers traced the rim of the teacup, noting the reflection of the rain-streaked window upon its surface, and I felt the familiar tingle of a detail sliding into place, not yet complete, but suggestive of direction. The conversation turned inevitably to human temperament. Lewis remarked upon the academic pride that so often breeds concealment rather than confession. I pondered the subtle interplay of ego, loyalty, and fear, recognizing the tension that binds the scholar's heart as tightly as the rules of logic and precedent. Even in their grief, the faculty's behavior revealed Fisher-Estony deviations, like the uneven pressure of a pen on paper or the barely noticeable hesitation before a name is spoken. We left the cafe as the clouds began to lighten slightly, the rain tapering into a delicate drizzle. The city exhaled in mist, streets glistening under the dimming light, and I carried with me the quiet conviction that every minor gesture, every slip of the pen or pause in conversation, was a breadcrumb along a path only patience and contemplation could fully illuminate. In Oxford, Secrets seldom vanish. They merely hide behind civility and habit, waiting for the mind willing to observe with care to uncover them. The evening air carried a chill as I made my way to the Sheldonian Theatre, the gas lamps flickering against the damp stone and casting long, quivering shadows across the cobbles. There was a deliberate slowness to my steps, not from hesitation, but from a desire to observe, to absorb the city's pulse before entering the cultivated stillness of the performance hall. The rain had left the streets gleaming, each puddle reflecting a fragment of light, and I noted the faint rustle of a coat sleeve against the wind, a subtle rhythm that would later register as inconsequential, yet now seemed to hold meaning. Inside, the theatre was suffused with the rich aroma of varnished wood and candle smoke, mingling with a faint undertone of pressed suits and evening gowns. I took my seat in the second tier, allowing my eyes to wander across the audience, cataloguing gestures and mannerisms. There was the professor's former student, hands resting lightly on the program, yet his fingers tapped a quiet impatience, a rhythm slightly off from the music's pulse. And there was a colleague, whispering to her neighbor, her words inaudible, but the tilt of her head and the fleeting glance toward the stage suggested awareness, perhaps even recognition, of some hidden tension that the music alone could not convey. During an aria, I noticed a subtle inconsistency in the program notes, an attribution to the wrong composer, a slight rearrangement of the pieces that did not correspond to the original schedule. To most, this would have passed unnoticed, but the gesture resonated with the minor disturbances I had catalogued elsewhere. A misquoted poem, a misfiled lecture, a misaligned page in the college register. Such small discrepancies form the fingerprints of intention, and my mind traced them with quiet patience, weaving an invisible lattice connecting seemingly disparate observations. Between acts, I lingered in the shadowed corridors, where the creak of floorboards underfoot echoed like a distant heartbeat. The whisper of a word here, a pause there, became significant in ways one cannot assign immediately. A brief exchange between the librarian and the Beadle caught my attention, a subtle nod, the merest tilt of the head, suggesting acknowledgement without speech. These gestures, minor and almost imperceptible, were the silent scaffolding upon which more substantial truths might later rest. I returned to my seat as the music swelled, the tones resonating with a melancholic beauty that seemed to underscore the city itself. The student's restless tapping had ceased, replaced by a stillness that was at once attentive and apprehensive. I wondered if he had noticed, or perhaps remembered, some detail now too subtle to articulate a half-glimpse of movement, a shadow misaligned against the stage. These half-formed observations often carry more weight than direct statements, leaving room for the mind to construct meaning from the fragments. As the final chords faded, I rose, allowing the tide of exciting patrons to carry me toward the evening air once more. The rain had softened to a drizzle, the lamps casting reflections that danced across the wet stones like scattered notes. I understood then, as I had often known before, that the theatre, the music, and the social choreography were not merely decoration, but a lens through which human character could be read. The evening had offered its clues with a delicate subtlety, and I carried them with me, quiet and insistent, ready to be unfolded in the days to come. Late that evening, back in my room, I retrieved the bundle of correspondence from Ainsworth's study, the letters already familiar, yet never quite exhausted of meaning. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the walls lined with books, each spine a silent witness to lives both ordinary and extraordinary. I unfolded a letter I had glanced at days before, now revisiting it with the patient scrutiny of a man accustomed to the subtle rhythm of human misdirection. The ink, faint but still legible, bore the careful hand of a scholar, yet there was an annotation in the margin I had not noticed, a small cross, precise, deliberate, unaccompanied by explanation. I held it against the lamp, examining the faint impressions of writing on the reverse, the slight indentation of pressure at the end of certain words. It occurred to me then that this was no mere flourish. It was a signal, quiet but insistent, the sort of clue easily dismissed unless one is attuned to the rhythm of nuance. The notation prompted me to re-examine the sequence of the other letters, each now resonating with a new subtlety. The pattern of dates, the recurrence of certain phrases, the pauses and hesitations that might be inferred from line breaks and marginal smudges. It was in these small, almost imperceptible gestures that the truth often hides, waiting for a patient mind to discern its shape. I recalled the moment at the opera, the misplaced attribution in the program, the student's half-remembered glance, and the Beadle's unyielding vigilance. Each of these incidents had seemed isolated, ephemeral, yet now they converged in my mind, suggesting a lattice of intention threading through otherwise ordinary events. I could almost trace the hand that had placed the letter in the bundle, anticipating its eventual rediscovery, knowing it would draw attention only to those observant enough to perceive the deliberate subtlety. The act of rereading transformed the letter from simple correspondence to a map of concealed priorities. Words that once seemed benign now suggested omission or emphasis, hint or hesitation, and I realized that Ainsworth, for all his scholarly composure, had woven small markers into his routine, unnoticed by most, yet powerful in their potential to illuminate human motives. There was a cadence here, a muted insistence like a faint crossword clue embedded in the pattern of language whose solution required patience rather than immediate revelation. Outside, the rain had softened to a whispering drizzle, tapping against the windows in irregular yet insistent rhythms. I allowed my mind to dwell on the minor discrepancies, the misdated lecture, the smudge on the register, the subtle adjustments of manuscripts by a junior hand. All these details were fragments of a larger design, the architecture of secrecy laid bare in increments that only a carefully reflective mind could perceive. I set the letter aside, the cross still lingering in my visions, a beacon of deliberate concealment. Each phrase, each pause, and each gesture in this city of stone and scholarship seemed to echo with hidden resonance, and I understood that even the smallest observation might unlock broader truths. The quiet insistence of these subtleties reminded me that the story was not yet complete, that patience and attention would ultimately reveal the contours of motive and action. In Oxford, as always, nothing is merely as it appears. The past leaves its subtle footprints for those willing to trace them. I wandered the cloisters that evening, the fading light painting the stone in muted shades of grey and amber. Each archway cast shadows that seemed to stretch farther than memory allowed, and the damp air carried the faint scent of moss and old parchment. My footsteps echoed softly, hollow and measured, each tap against the worn flagstones a quiet punctuation in the lingering calm. It was in this half-light that Oxford reveals itself not merely as a city, but as a repository of hidden intent, where gestures, words and silences are catalogued in ways both deliberate and accidental. I noticed a student lingering near the corner of the quadrangle, ostensibly absorbed in a notebook, yet his fingers trembled ever so slightly as they traced the lines of his writing. The hesitation was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it suggested awareness, perhaps even concealment of thought. Nearby, the Beadle moved with the measured precision of a man habituated to observation, yet his eyes strayed toward a doorway that led to a long, dark corridor. There was nothing overt in his movement, no outward sign of agitation, and yet the placement of his attention, coupled with the careful, almost ritualized adjustment of his coat, hinted at protective vigilance. Subtle signs such as these, minor as they may seem, are the threads from which I trace the outline of motive. A shadowed whisper reached me from the library doorway, a fragment of conversation, and I noted the exact inflection and timing of the words. They suggested not malice, but circumspection, the deliberate shaping of language to reveal only what one intends to be seen. I catalogued the nuance alongside prior observations, the misquoted poem, the altered program at the opera, the annotation in the letter. Each was a minor distortion, a slight misalignment that, when viewed collectively, began to form a pattern that might illuminate intention, though the precise image remained just beyond reach. Passing a stone bench, I observed a misaligned manuscript resting atop it, its edges protruding slightly as if displaced by a hand long absent. Such minor deviations are often overlooked by the inattentive, yet they act as signposts in a landscape of concealment. I bent to note the faint impression of a name beneath the paper, barely legible, suggesting hurried consultation or deliberate misdirection. My mind traced the possibility of movement, timing, and purpose, integrating the observation with the ongoing puzzle that had begun to crystallize around Ainsworth's final days. The fog thickened between the arches, softening the edges of sight and sound, leaving only the essentials to register the cadence of a distant footstep, the subtle shift of air as a door opened, the muted reflection of lantern light on damp stone. It was here, in the liminal space between shadow and structure, that small truths are often glimpsed first, before articulation or confirmation. I felt the familiar thrill of a clue that has yet to speak fully, and allowed my attention to linger on it, patient, reflective, prepared for the ripple it might create in the web of observation. By the time I left the cloisters, the night had deepened, the arches now pools of darkness punctuated by distant points of light. Every detail, every minor gesture and hesitation had been recorded in the quiet ledger of my mind. The evening had offered its lessons in subtlety, concealment, and the deliberate shaping of perception. Oxford, in its half-light and shadow, had whispered once more, and I knew that the threads I had observed would reappear, guiding me toward the revelations that, for now, remained just out of reach. I returned to St. Edmund's College early the following morning, the mist still clinging to the stone like a hesitant memory. The air carried that damp, earthy scent that seems to settle in Oxford after prolonged rain, blending with the faint aroma of aged paper and polished wood. My steps were measured as I moved toward the archive room, a place where time itself seems to conspire with shadows, preserving not merely records but the moods and intentions of those long absent. It was there, among the stacked folios and leather-bound ledgers, that I found what I had not known I was seeking, an old-school photograph tucked between volumes of Latin exercises, its edges yellowed and curling, and beneath it a partially torn diary page with ink faded to a melancholy brown. The photograph depicted a younger Ainsworth, flanked by a rival from his early academic years, their expressions formal yet betraying subtle tensions, the kind that grow with age and pride. I studied the lines of the faces, noting the slight tilt of the head, the set of the shoulders, the half-smile that did not quite reach the eyes. These micro-expressions, once fleeting, became more significant when viewed in the context of decades of rivalry, the accumulation of grievances quietly nurtured. The diary page beneath it was a fragment, a partial entry that hinted at a disagreement over scholarship, written with precision but abruptly interrupted, as if the hand had been halted by some external or internal force. I traced the faded ink with my fingertips, feeling the depression of the pen in the fiber of the paper. There was a pattern emerging from the fragment's annotations in letters, misaligned entries in the register, subtle gestures at the opera and in the cloisters. Each had seemed isolated when first observed, yet together they suggested a chain of cause and consequence, faint but persistent. The half-erased name on the diary page, coupled with the photograph, indicated not merely rivalry, but a deliberate effort to obscure connection, a concealment of associations that might have been known only to those present at the time. I noted the parallel to a crossword clue left unfinished, where the absence of a single letter changes the entire solution. I replaced the photograph carefully and catalogued the diary fragment in my mind, understanding that the past had left its marks subtly, as shadows leave impressions on stone. I recalled earlier interactions, the Beadle's vigilant presence, the junior tutor's hesitant manipulations of manuscripts, the student's fleeting glances. Each small irregularity now resonated with historical intent, and I began to see the architecture of concealment that had shaped events long before the recent death. The past was not merely a record, but an active participant, its echoes influencing the present in ways one can only detect through patience and careful attention. Outside, the morning mist began to lift, revealing the stone of the quadrangle slick and shining, yet unchanged in essence. I stepped back, allowing the impressions of observation to settle around me, and I understood that the revelation of this hidden history would inform every subsequent inquiry. Secrets, once buried, persist in traces, gestures, annotations, photographs, and fragments of memory, waiting for a mind attuned to the subtleties of timing, presence, and omission. The past had spoken, quietly, insistently, and I had listened, as I always must in Oxford. I found the Beadle in his customary post near the college gates, the early evening mist curling about the lamps and casting shadows that pooled like ink across the cobbles. He regarded me with a calm, deliberate gaze, the sort that measured not only distance but intention, and I felt immediately the quiet weight of observation pressing between us. There was no overt tension, no tremor of fear, only the subtle rigidness of a man accustomed to scrutiny, yet unused to being scrutinized in the manner I now applied. I approached slowly, noting the slight adjustment of his coat, the careful placement of hands as though protecting something unseen, in the measured shift of weight from one foot to the other. I began quietly, recounting minor details I had observed over the preceding days. The irregular hours, noted in the college register, the hesitant gestures of students, the subtle misalignments in manuscripts and letters. Each observation, though seemingly trivial alone, had taken on significance in concert, and I watched his face for any flicker of recognition. He offered no words, no protest, only a faint tightening around the eyes, the slight narrowing of a gaze that spoke without articulation. It was the sort of response that reveals far more than speech when properly read, a quiet acknowledgement of a hidden pattern now brought into focus. As we walked slowly along the misted quadrangle, I observed the faint pressure of his fingers against the edge of the gate, the micro-adjustments of posture that betrayed a subtle tension. I recalled the misquoted poem, the marginal cross in Ainsworth's letter, the misdated lecture in the register. Each clue, each minor irregularity, had converged to form a lattice of inference pointing toward his vigilant presence, and now I could see the outline of deliberate concealment. There was no haste, no theatrical revelation, only the quiet unspooling of a truth that had been encoded in gestures, times, and omissions. The Beadle finally spoke, his voice measured and careful, reflecting the reserve of a man who is long observed but seldom revealed. His words offered context, yet avoided confession, the sort of subtle deflection that required one to read between lines, to note what was left unsaid as much as what was articulated. I listened, cataloguing pauses, shifts of emphasis, and slight hesitations, the minor dissonances that accompany truths partially disclosed. These, combined with the evidence previously gathered, illuminated a path through the fog of observation toward understanding the depth and motive behind his actions. We paused near the main gates, the mist swirling around our feet, and I allowed silence to settle, giving the weight of the accumulated details time to press upon both our thoughts. In the stillness, the minor inconsistencies observed over weeks, the timing of visits, the faint gestures, the misalignments in seemingly trivial records coalesced into a subtle narrative. It was not an accusation shouted or demanded, but a quiet recognition that the lattice of concealment had been penetrated, that the truth had begun to reveal its outlines to the patient observer. As I departed, the Beadle remained poised, neither defeated nor triumphant, only measured in a quiet acknowledgement of a game now partially understood. The mist clung to the lamps, the quadrangle emptied, and I walked away with the sense that, while the immediate resolution had not yet arrived, the framework of revelation was now in place. Oxford, in its fog and stone, had spoken again, and the silent pulse of observation had illuminated the contours of human intent, delicate and insistent. I returned to Ainsworth's study in the quiet of late afternoon, the light muted and soft through the rain-streaked windows. Dust motes drifted lazily in the narrow shafts of sun, catching the silence of the room like a fragile web. I had already examined much of the correspondence and manuscripts, yet a small, unassuming, leather-bound volume drew my attention anew, tucked beneath a stack of more prominent tomes. The cover bore no title, merely a faintly embossed monogram that I recognized from earlier letters, subtle enough to escape casual notice. I retrieved it carefully, aware that even the weight of the hand could leave marks that speak to intent and care. Opening the volume, I discovered a manuscript fragment, its edges slightly frayed, the ink a warm brown with faint traces of erasure. The handwriting was precise, yet occasionally hesitant, the pauses between words suggesting deliberation rather than error. I traced a line with my finger, noting the subtle indentation of letters and the careful placement of marginal notes. It was clear that this was no casual document, but a carefully preserved testament, perhaps unfinished, intended to convey meaning to a select few. As often occurs in Oxford, the smallest artifact can illuminate more than an entire library of printed volumes when examined with patience and attention. The content was less remarkable in its words than in the patterns it revealed. References to earlier lectures, cross-referenced with annotations in other volumes, pointed to discrepancies in the recorded sequences, subtle manipulations of timing and attendance. These had been invisible to those who merely glanced, yet now they formed an underlying rhythm that harmonized with previous observations. The misdated lecture, the misaligned register entries, the marginal cross in a letter. The manuscript was a cipher of intent, a lattice of motives and opportunity woven quietly into the record of scholarly life. I paused to consider the Beadle's role in this network of small but consequential acts. The alignment of the manuscript, the careful placement of documents, and the timing of his presence at the college gates all suggested deliberate orchestration, though devoid of overt confrontation. It was in such subtle orchestration that the human mind often leaves traces of the pressure of a hand, the tilt of a document, the minor hesitation in speech or gesture. I catalogued these with the quiet patience of observation, knowing that each would contribute to the eventual illumination of motive. Outside, the rain had softened to a drizzle, the streets reflecting the muted glow of lamps along St. Edmund's Lane. I allowed myself a brief glance at the quadrangle, now empty and shadowed, before returning to the manuscript. The act of careful reading, of aligning notes with letters and registers, produced an emergent clarity, a faint outline of actions previously obscured. Even in the absence of confession or confrontation, the manuscript offered a narrative, subtle yet insistent, that suggested pride, secrecy, and the human impulse to conceal error or misdeed. Closing the leather-bound volume, I replaced it carefully and stepped back, absorbing the stillness of the room. The details of the past, preserved in ink and paper, had whispered their truths, though much remained hidden, as it always does in Oxford. The hidden manuscript, seemingly unremarkable to the casual observer, had illuminated threads otherwise unnoticed, drawing connections between people, gestures, and events that had seemed isolated until now. It was a reminder that even the quietest record can bear witness to the intricacies of human intent, and that the path to understanding is often lined with subtle, deliberate traces. The day had surrendered to evening when I walked along the river, the water dark and still, reflecting the lamplight like scattered fragments of memory. A chill hung in the air, damp and insistent, carrying the faint smell of wet stone and distant smoke from hearths along the quadrangles. I moved slowly, as though each step allowed the details of the case to settle in the quiet recesses of thought, letting the events of the past days drift into reflection rather than conclusion. There was a rhythm to the city at this hour, measured, contemplative, as if Oxford itself paused to breathe. I thought of the Beadle, standing steadfast in the mist near the college gates, his careful vigilance both protective and secretive. The minor irregularities he had orchestrated, the precise hours, the subtle guidance of students, the small obfuscations in registers and manuscripts were now comprehensible not as malice but as a quiet assertion of order, shaped by pride, loyalty, and perhaps a lingering sense of wronged dignity. Even the smallest gesture, the tilt of a head, the microsecond pause in a step, now seemed charged with intent, revealing the delicate architecture of human motivation. The hidden manuscript, the misquoted poem, the diary fragment, and the letters with their marginal notes, all of these, when placed together, formed a lattice through which the truth could finally be traced. Yet the resolution was not one of dramatic revelation. It was a quiet acknowledgement that patterns, once unnoticed, may be discerned only by those willing to observe with patience and restraint. The act of seeing, of noting, of understanding, without the need for immediate declaration, was itself a form of justice, subtle and enduring. I paused near the low stone wall lining the river, allowing my eyes to follow the drifting reflections and the occasional ripple that disturbed their perfection. Such movements, though minor, reminded me of the faint tremors of influence that individuals leave upon their environment, gestures, omissions, hesitations, each echoing in ways rarely apparent at the moment. I considered the faculty, the students, the observers, each caught in their private rhythms, all contributing unknowingly to a narrative that had remained obscured until patient attention brought it into faint, resolute clarity. The evening light waned further, and I felt the quiet ache that accompanies the end of a case, a mixture of satisfaction and the subtle melancholy of impermanence. Even when truths are discerned, human complexity remains, layers of pride, secrecy, and longing that resist full articulation. The Beadle's actions, Ainsworth's meticulous records, and the intricate web of observations were not merely a record of events, but a testament to the enduring interplay of character and circumstance, subtle and relentless. As I turned toward the bridge, the river flowing dark beneath, I understood that Oxford keeps its secrets well, yet also offers them to those who know how to look, to trace the faintest outlines, to read between lines and gestures. The fog had begun to return, softening edges, blurring distinction between light and shadow, as if the city itself wished to remind the observer of its persistent elusiveness. I walked on, aware that the quiet pulse of observation, patience, and reflection would always reveal what words or declarations might never capture, leaving an ache of understanding both complete and incomplete, a truth in twilight, lingering beyond the final step.